Hi, I'm Isabel. The other
And
person here is Jenny, and we're students in the MA Conservation of Archaeological and Ethnographic Materials at UCLA. We're really fortunate to be hosting this program. We're going to start today with a land grant acknowledgement for the LA area, even though many of us are not physically there. That's where our program is based.
yeah, so before we begin, we'd like to say that the UCLA Getty IDP acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovang are, now known or currently known as the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hanukvetem, Ahihirom, and Iohin Kem, past, present, and emerging.
As we said, we're really excited to be here today. This month's Conservation Conversation, which is monthly talk series where we invite new guests who are engaged with exciting research in the conservation fields to talk to us. We welcome William Posadas, who will be discussing how conservators can support the repatriation of Indigenous belongings under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, commonly known as NAGPRA, as well as how conservators can address concerns beyond NAGPRA that are relevant to the repatriation process and experience and to the training of future generations of conservators.
So before we begin, we'd like to introduce our speaker. So Lilian Posadas has experience with repatriation and collaborative and community-driven research within museums, universities, and community organizations. She is interested in how institutional policies support the development and sustainability of collaborative research and collections care practices. Lilium focuses on systematic institutional change in support of repatriation, collections care and access, representation and diversity initiatives, and the use of non-destructive and non-invasive methods of investigating community-driven research questions. She received an MSc in the Technology and Analysis of Archaeological Materials from the University College London, and a double BA in Anthropology and Psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles. Lilium has participated in field research, including preservation efforts in Ghana, Peru, Louisiana, and California, and also serves on several boards and committees, including the Mellon Opportunity for Diversity and Conservation. Lilium is also involved in community-driven research, policy development, and advocacy in public health, which informs her approach to heritage work. So with that, we'll hand it over to Lilium. Thank you again for joining us. We're very excited to see your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'd of course first like to thank all of the organizers for inviting me to participate in this series. There's been a lot of very wonderful speakers and I'm happy to be a participant. First of all, I'd also like to share a little bit more about myself outside of my very academic museum professional bio. Just to personalize this a little bit more. So I am first and foremost not a conservator. So thank you for your generosity in inviting a non-conservator to talk about conservation. But instead I work with conservators and appreciate conservators. And some of this talk is kind of a love letter to the conservators in my life who have been incredibly supportive in my work. I was trained as an archaeologist, and my experience with museums, I like to think, goes back to growing up in 1990s Los Angeles, where I currently still reside. And I grew up about 2 miles away from the California Science Center, the California African American Museum, and the LA County Natural History Museum. When I was in undergrad at UCLA, I had an opportunity to study abroad in Ghana, where I was exposed to community archaeology for the first time. But when I returned to the US, I noticed that projects were sometimes very removed from communities and were often commercial projects. It also it also didn't help that I took an osteology class with a professor who kept portions of a mummified Peruvian woman in a cupboard next to a window in her lab, and an individual which she claimed was donated to her by someone who found her in their parents' attic. Unfortunately, ever since then, I've heard many more stories like that. Eventually, I found, and I was very fortunate to find work as a work study student in a position focused on repatriation under Wendy Teeter at the Fowler Museum at UCLA, who has been an incredible mentor and had opportunities to learn experientially, to connect with tribal leaders, and to work with tribes and to witness firsthand what it was like to work towards repatriation within a tremendous, complicated University of California bureaucracy and actually achieve it. I have been working on repatriation and collections stewardship issues ever since. I also want to point out that all of this was happening in my life at the time of the Great Recession. And I want to draw a parallel to that experience and our current situation where an estimated 30% of all museum jobs may not be coming back. And I want to tell anyone who may be listening, who is graduating from a program or is early in their career and facing the situation, that there is a generation of us who know what it's like and know how hard it can be, and that there is a community of folks out here to support you however we can. And that now especially is the time to think creatively about how to do the work you are passionate about differently, outside of the traditional systems and structures that we are witnessing struggle. And also, before I move on to the content of the talk, I do want to acknowledge that we are living, of course, in a pandemic. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the impact that that has had on many of us here on this call and on our friends and families. My family was very lucky to survive a COVID scare over the winter. So as we discuss working with one another and with communities, we now must also consider how we can continue the work of repatriation and caring for collections while still ensuring the safety and health of everyone involved, particularly because it is often the elders in communities who consult and review collections for repatriation. So a lot has happened between when I was first asked to participate in this program last year and now. So I've been thinking a lot about how to best structure this presentation, and I've decided to organize it loosely around these four concepts. Building relationships with one another in support of repatriation as colleagues, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which I'm going to do a little critique of, hopeful critique, hopefully, professional ethics, guiding our knowledge and skill sets, and then the future generations of conservators and how we can best prepare them for this kind of work. But first of all, considering that we may have people in the audience who come from a variety of different backgrounds, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about repatriation and what I mean when I talk about repatriation. So I'm referencing NAGPRA, which stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And that was passed in 1990, so it's 30 years old now. And what I'm only going to be giving the bare minimum basics just to make sure we're all on the same page there. But please learn more. You can visit the National NAGPRA website, and the Association of American Indian Affairs website also contains a lot of info sheets and information about NAGPRA, how it works, and how to get it going. So, but on its face, it means that federally funded institutions, no matter what that funding was for, must comply with this federal legislation. This is federal legislation. And it states that sacred, ceremonial, cultural patrimony items and human remains and their burial items must be returned to the communities that they belong to. Also, I want to reference the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The United States the Senate has not ratified it, but I think the Obama administration did sort of support it in 2010. And Article 12 states that Indigenous people have the right to use and control their ceremonial objects and the right to the repatriation of their ancestral human remains. There are also state and local laws that govern repatriation. And for anyone who is listening, who is from an institution that previously did not receive federal monies and did not need to comply with NAGPRA, if you have now received a PPP loan, you are now subject to NAGPRA. So that is something very important to consider and to plan for. And I do encourage everyone who works in museums, who has an interest in working with museums, especially those who work more directly with collections, to at the bare minimum know the very basics of NAGPRA. So we also have to consider so when we engage in NAGPRA and repatriation, to me, that means that we are engaging in a process of acknowledging that an injustice has occurred and needs to be addressed and corrected as best as possible. We can never completely undo what was done, but we can move forward differently. And unfortunately, the repatriation itself, in my opinion, is not the end of the work. It's really just the beginning of the work. We have to also consider what was gained by having these collections at the museum. How have museums benefited while perpetuating harm? Papers have been published, funding has been awarded, and the museum, as an authority, informed public opinion about Indigenous communities for a long time, and continues to still do so. And these opinions also inform public policy and legislation. So these legacies must also be addressed, and therefore, if an institution has such a legacy, repatriation alone, like I mentioned, is not enough, and real long-term commitment is critical, involving a prioritization of this work and a real investment of time and resources. There are not a lot of examples, unfortunately, of this broader, more meaningful, transformative approach to this work, but one institution that's doing a really interesting and very different job than many other places is the Museum of Us, formerly the Museum of Man in San Diego and Balboa Park. So I encourage those who are interested to take a look at their website, visit them when they are open, and follow any online content that they may be presenting and learn more about what they're doing and how they're doing it. So the reality check here with repatriation work is that even though this legislation is 30 years old, for some museums, it still feels as though it's brand new. There's still a lot of ignorance about the legislation, about how it works, how it functions. Museum positions that tackle this work are relatively new as well. They are still mostly grant-funded positions. And so when the grant ends, the work stops, but it doesn't mean that the work is completed. Some people are fortunate enough to be in permanent repatriation positions, but sometimes those people are the only person in that doing that work, and sometimes there's a real disproportionate balance of staff capacity compared to the actual task at hand. And so unfortunately, even qualified people who are trained properly to work in this area are sometimes set up to fail. And there's a lot of history to tackle and a lot of work to do. So often it does impact the access that Indigenous communities have to collections and the scale and scope of project timelines. And projects can take years, and projects can take, in some cases, decades, and it really can be better. So how do we support each other? How do we move the work forward? How can conservators in particular support these efforts? And so firstly, something as simple as developing relationships with your colleagues can be significant. But also, what kind of relationships are we talking about? There's been a lot of discussion in museums about the importance of developing relationships, yet I have heard a lot less about what we actually mean when we talk about relationships, and what kind of guidance or details are we discussing about how to develop relationships, how to sustain them. It shouldn't be assumed that we all know how to create and maintain healthy, productive relationships with others. And probably most of us know that sometimes relationships are not good. Sometimes they can be harmful and exploitative or extractive and leave us exhausted with very little to show for it. So what I mean by relationships between conservators and repatriation staff is I want the development of supportive relationships. I do believe in our ability to support one another in this work. I have experienced it firsthand with collections and conservation staff being in my very fortunate experience. Some of the first people to really support me in repatriation projects with more than rhetoric. People are very quick to support the work to a degree, But then when push comes to shove and people have to put in time and resources, they're nowhere to be found. But in my experience, fortunately, conservators have shown up with real tangible contributions that significantly moved repatriation processes forward. Conservators have allowed me to provide tribes with detailed and technical information that they had requested, and they have helped ensure that repatriated belongings could arrive at their destination safely, and helped to provide whatever material resources could be provided to assist tribes once their belongings arrived home. I want us to have an awareness of how we can build relationships with one another in such a way that the communities with whom we work are receiving the best we have to offer. Being in a supportive relationship does not mean that we do not challenge each other. I'm a big X-Files fan, and these two often challenged each other, but they made a good team. In fact, it does mean that we do kindly challenge each other, encourage each other, check each other, and work through mistakes together and hold each other accountable to improve. And how do we build and sustain effective and supportive relationships? Well, when working with people on repatriation visits, just to take a little bit of a step back, I try to be very sensitive to the environment we are inviting people into. Who will be greeting them? Will there be snacks during breaks? Will there be time to step outside? Can we make sure to handle everything they want to handle and make the most of their time? So if someone wants to support repatriation, they need to be able to help support the development of a caring, considerate, and also disciplined and rigorous environment where questions are answered thoroughly, thoughtfully, and honestly, and there is a keen attention to detail and to communication. With these efforts, will these efforts be superficial and therefore ineffective and perhaps even harmful? Or will they be coming from a place of real reflection and study and transformative practice? And as we work on repatriation, many of us in the heritage fields are also confronting the reality of discrimination and inequity and hostility within our own fields and how it impacts our ability to do our jobs effectively. And diversity, equity, and inclusion programs tend to come up as a solution to these problems. Some of us have been here before and are not haven't experienced any real significant changes. So with this renewed interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the last few years, I want us to really ask ourselves, what will be different this time? Will we really be bold enough to create new systems, better systems, to let go of systems that don't work, and to be willing to go through the process of trying something new, letting that fail, trying something else, improving it, tweaking it to create better systems for all of us. And we also critically need to address funding and resource disparities. It takes, as they say, money to make money, and institutions that have funding often receive a lot of funding, and institutions that don't struggle sometimes to apply for grants. So that's something to consider. And also, community governance of museums is an issue that I'm interested in exploring. How can we involve boards and funding institutions, but maybe develop other ways of governing institutions where maybe we have community representation on boards that have greater direct control of how the museum is governed. And also, there's been in the last several years efforts to unionize museum employees, and there has, at least from what I've witnessed, a bit of a push and pull between DEAI initiatives and efforts to unionize. So I don't want us to replace one with the other. Oftentimes unionizing is what is in the best interest of employees at some of these museums, and will help the work move forward by providing employees with stability and financial security. So we need to move forward towards action and away from complacency, even if the action is to get out of the way so the work can be done. Because being complacent is like sitting in a truck. I have this whole little truck metaphor to dive into, where you have, so the struggle of getting the work done, moving through repatriation, transforming institutions is it's an uphill battle. We're dealing with structures that were not equipped for this, and histories, hundreds of years of histories all over the world that have led to the situation where we need to be repatriating items. And there are people pushing that truck up that hill forward, and there are people resisting that and trying to push it down. And then there are people who are, by not doing anything, not choosing to take steps towards action, maybe don't believe that they are impacting the situation, but actually you're making it a lot harder. You're sitting in the truck and making the truck heavier. So if you don't think you're capable of, or you're not confident to do anything, or you don't feel like you're prepared, please get there. I encourage you to get there. There are resources out there. People have been doing this work for a long time. There's literature, there's community organizations. Reach out to those groups and see how you can grow into a person who can feel comfortable taking action. But if you can take the simple action of getting out of the way, getting out of the truck, lightening the load, that helps too. Eventually, hopefully, you can help push the truck up the hill, or clear the way in front of the truck, or help push back the people who are pushing against this progress. So I'm not going to go too much into this intersectionality, but I did want to put it here. These are two definitions of intersectionality. It's a concept that's been around for a long time now. And the reason why I'm plopping it in here is because, unfortunately, I think we're still struggling with this in the heritage fields, and we need to catch up. That's really all I have to say about that. We need to catch up. We need to really get grounded in this practice and start employing it in our work. To me, at its very fundamentals, it's about acknowledging the overall humanity of a person and our complexities, rather than individuals being, one-dimensional tokens. And now on to this section that I want to call, come on now, just come on now. Repatriation is a direct, tangible, material expression of what people are claiming to value with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Here we have something that's been around since 1990, a federal legislation that we all need to comply with, or those of us who receive federal funding anyway. And we could be in the work, moving it forward, fulfilling, expressing these values, and putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. And if we have time, I can go into some stories about that have been some recent reminders about how, for me, about how we're not there yet, but maybe I'll save that for later. But I think that we're still looking at each other, our colleagues, as parts based on identities that they may embody, and not as whole, complete persons. We're still separating repatriation work away from other programs and initiatives that would otherwise very clearly connect to repatriation work. And we're still removing, there's still not enough funding going into this work, and dedication and time and support. And so I want to also bring this up because this leads me to think about whose experiences are we valuing. And I was looking through my phone and came across this from some years ago. And I have this image that reminds me that we are still experiencing an HIV/AIDS pandemic that continues to impact the most vulnerable in our communities despite significant advances in treatment and prevention. And I bring this up mostly to highlight community knowledge and community systems of care and relational interdependence, and what we can achieve if those with direct lived experience tackling problems and finding sustainable solutions, sometimes with very little resources and not a lot of support, are able to lead on a larger scale. Let's imagine where we would be if the knowledge and experience of communities like the LGBT community, people of color, Black and Indigenous communities were valued within systems and institutions that have historically excluded and continue to exclude our communities. What better models and practices would we have today? How much less harm would have been enacted? Who are our colleagues and community members who have survived working in hostile and discriminatory professional and educational environments, and what can they teach us about what needs to change and how? Which brings me to our professional standards. They tell us a lot about who we are and who we want to be. Ethical standards reflect values and priorities and shape the internal culture of the discipline by encouraging and enforcing what is considered professional and unprofessional practice. I believe that the standards for professional ethical practice must be developed by a diverse and experienced staff if the field is intending to serve diverse communities and tackle significant historical and contemporary problems, so that we can fix what is broken, which conservators should know a lot about. We need to build trust. Sometimes there isn't trust between professionals working in museums and heritage fields and the communities and communities. We need to practice humility in addressing what we do not know and how we cannot help, and also generosity with the skills, knowledge, and resources that we do have when we are invited to share them. We need to be asking, who are we doing this work for? Why are we doing this? And whose things are these really anyway? If they break because people enjoyed them, they can be fixed. Who is controlling what is valuable about an object? Is an item's value in its static condition or in how it is used and who it brings together and why? And to some extent, the presence of these items in museums has also shifted the knowledge and skills about fixing them away from communities and over to museum professionals. So let's think about how we can maybe relax a little bit and let go of some control. So the following are some examples for how conservators have been able to assist me with my work. First off, one of the ways that conservators have supported me is in ensuring that when tribes are taking their belongings home and are facing a really long journey, that they can feel confident that their items will arrive home safely. So conservators have contributed to the design and creation of specialized housing to ensure things are not moving around while they're on these trips. They've also assisted in packing vehicles to keep everything safe and secure. And we offer this when it's requested. So these are all conversations that happen throughout the repatriation and consultation process. This is not just us saying, we'll do this for you. We're telling you you want this, you're gonna want this, you're gonna want these things to be cared for in these ways. No, these are all conversations. We can offer materials, we can offer resources, we can offer expertise. And if tribes want to take advantage of them, want us to do specific things, then we can find ways to accommodate those requests. Conservators have also helped me with developing grants and adding in funding for the cost of materials that otherwise I probably wouldn't add or wouldn't think to add or wouldn't know where to start. And so not all tribes are interested in this, but some tribes that I've worked with are opening up their own museums, and they want to prepare spaces ahead of time before objects return home. And they're also seeking some guidance on what kind of materials might help them, do something like ensure that an object can be carried safely from the truck that brought the object home into the museum space. What kinds of boxes they should buy. And I've been fortunate enough to work with conservators who have provided me with information and allowed us to really buy materials for tribes so that they can take them with them on repatriation projects. And also conservators have been very open to how things could be done and haven't set up one strict guideline that things have to be done a certain way and people need these specific, sets of equipment. But it's really about, again, that conversation and really listening to what people need. And also reminding people that they don't have to do things the way the museum does them. They can do things differently, and that's fine. And there are ways to still achieve the goals that they want to achieve while doing things in a way that's more culturally appropriate. Also, something to keep in mind is that when we return some of these items, we're not returning them often in the conditions that we received them. Sometimes they have been physically altered, sometimes in potentially harmful ways. There are pesticides and other contaminants that have sometimes been sprayed on these objects, things like arsenic, like mercury, lead. So it's a problem. It's a problem. And NAGPRA requires institutions to tell tribes if they have a history of using these kinds of pesticides on objects. But we can take it a step further. So again, in conversations with tribes, if you have the capability to do PXRF testing, and tribes are okay with that, if they know about the process, if you work together on the process, something we've done is test objects and provide reports, accessible reports with the data, so tribes know what may or may not contain harmful pesticides and can inform decisions that they need to make about how they want to maybe reintroduce some of these items into ceremonial practice. And also museum labels, another thing that has changed some of these objects physically. Sometimes the labels are just these tags that are tied to an object. Sometimes they're placed in an object in a way that doesn't really harm the object, can be easily removed. Sometimes they are stapled on things, they're glued on things. They're tied in a way that ends up breaking the object. So there's a lot going on. And then there's also labeling that happens directly on objects. So, which can be a very unfortunate situation, to return an object that has numbers all over it, these markers of museums claiming these objects as their own. Sometimes objects have labels of tribes, names that tribes don't use to refer to themselves, but have been historically used in museums, and sometimes those names are offensive. So we also have conversations with tribes on whether or not they'd like us to work towards removing some of these things from objects. Sometimes conservators are able to remove things in a way that I would never know looking at something that anything was ever there, which is fantastic. Sometimes it's a bit tougher and you can still see traces of things, but at least it's not as drastic. So this is a service that we offer, and I've offered in some of my work. I encourage people to look into this, and it's something that tribes have taken us up on, and we've been able to do. And another thing is, conservators can help with caring for offerings and altars. So we have oftentimes museums, well, I don't know if oftentimes, but sometimes museums that work with communities will have altars in collection spaces where a lot of community objects are held, where a lot of these belongings are held. And they allow people who are visiting for consultation visits to have a moment of reflection, to place something on the altar if they like, and to know that these offerings and this altar is going to stay in a room in proximity to these items. And conservators can play a role in ensuring that these altars are well cared for, that they stay clean, that nothing goes missing, that pests don't harm anything, and also in ensuring that the altar serves its purpose, in that if we were instructed by a tribe to maintain an offer or an altar with a collection or a collection space or an object, that we follow through on that we create systems where things can stay together, because things often move. are pulled for a variety of different reasons or move from one location, one building to another building. And these altars and offerings can become disconnected. But that's not the point. The point is to keep them together. So we need to find ways to do that. And I have these glass mason jars here because sometimes, because in my experience, one of our colleagues, Desiree Martinez, who is a Tongva museum professional and archaeologist and has worked, who I've worked with and eager to continue working with, is amazing. She worked with on developing this method where we can have objects, we can have offerings that contain organic material in museum spaces where they can be safe from pests, and also keep the object safe from pests. So she recommended using these mason jars. So it's glass, you can see what's in them, and they can help keep both the offering and the item safe. And this one is a favorite of mine, what I like to call spotting red flags, setting pause, and encouraging communication. So from earlier, we did not, sometimes repatriation staff can be stretched very thin. And sometimes because of the structure of an institution or just because of capacity issues, there may be some disconnect between more established museum departments like curatorial or exhibitions development or education or whoever, and the repatriation teams. And conservators are sometimes very involved, particularly when it comes to exhibition development. And they can act as a stopgap, where if something doesn't quite feel right, something is an object that regardless of whether or not it's eligible for NAGPRA, which is something that we learn about through consultation, conservators can ask questions, can ask, did the community consult on this object? And the answer may be yes, everything's fine, move forward. Or it might prompt someone to think about how they might need to start consulting with community. Or you might be able to connect them with someone who can help them connect with community, or inform other staff, whether it's the repatriation staff or other curators that support is needed in this area. Hitting pause helps slow down the process so that consultation can happen, or so that objects that maybe are not appropriate for display can be pulled, and hopefully can encourage better systems of communication between departments. But I know that as scandals have ensued in museums or other places, things that have been shown that should not have been shown, as those things happen, people are often left asking, how did it ever get that far? How did no one catch it? And sometimes it's because there's a diversity problem. The right people aren't looking at the right things. And sometimes, someone could have asked a question and didn't. Someone could have hit pause and asked, and doesn't have to be the expert, but could divert to an expert, could bring in a community member, and that didn't happen. So it's better safe than sorry, better hit pause than moving forward with something that could become a problem later. And finally, fulfilling tribal requests for changes to collections care. So this is very important. As collections are getting prepared for repatriation, there may be special requests for how the museum needs to care for them. And there are also objects that maybe under NAGPRA are not eligible for repatriation, but need to be cared for in specific ways, in different ways than traditional museum practice dictates. And in my opinion, objects that need that kind of special care should probably not be in the museum. It should probably also be returning home, even though they may not fall under NAGPRA, but that's up to institutions and their own internal policies. But one way of looking at this is, I have this picture of a garden, because when we care for gardens, we acknowledge that these are living beings, plants that need things. They need air, they need sunlight, they need water, they need shade, they need attention and care. And so do many of the objects that are in museums. And when we consult with tribes, they can often give us information for how we can best care for their things in preparation for getting them home. And the conditions will never be the same as what can happen when an object is in the community, but we can try and accommodate these requests as best as possible, and conservators can play a critical role there. And so training emerging conservators, I've been very fortunate to work with the Andrew W. Mellon Opportunity for Diversity and Conservation, UCLA, and have met several cohorts now of young emerging conservators, and have been so encouraged by where things are going, who ask amazing questions, who are very critical, who are very interested and very enthusiastic. And so I want us to hopefully, those of us that are already doing this work, we can work more closely together interinstitutionally within our professional networks to create environments that are supportive of this new generation of conservators. And so one of the things that I want to encourage is that some of us who may end up supervising these interns, that we receive training. Just because we're really good at something doesn't necessarily mean we know how to work with people or how to really guide a student. Or even if that, we've been guiding students for a long time, maybe we're working with a group of students that, where training can only help us give them a better experience, more improved experience. And so I'm already very proud of them. I'm eager to see what it will be like to work with them. And I hope that those of us doing the work can be responsible in how we can leverage our resources and our access to open pathways for this new generation of students. And for those of you who are students, please contact me if you want to talk about anything. And also take care of yourself and take care of each other as you do a lot of this work. And that's what I have for now. Oh no, I can't. I think I have one more slide, but it's not moving over. Maybe I don't have it. Okay, so thank you very much. I had one more slide, but I can't find it. And I want to, if we can take questions, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. If we could, well, I guess you can't really see, but if we can all give a virtual round of applause to our speaker, we can definitely switch over to Q&A. You're getting a lot of thank yous and verbal applauses in the chat right now. So we definitely have a few questions that we can start off with. The first one is actually a request. An anonymous attendee asked if the truck diagram metaphor, they said, I love the truck diagram metaphor. Is it available for sharing in a small group with attribution, of course?
Yeah, I created that last night. And if you like it, if it works, we can find a way to get it to you.
Yeah, if anyone who's interested can just email me, and I can put you in contact, and my information I can drop in the chat or is attached to the invite that was originally sent out.
I'm sorry for rushing there at the end. I was looking at my watch and I wanted to make sure there was enough time for questions.
Yeah, no, this was perfect. We have enough time. We have actually more questions coming in now. But our first kind of question is from Ellen, who asks, is there a way that you would recommend labeling collections considering repatriation? Because you had mentioned about a lot of them having labels or tags attached to them.
Great question. And that's one thing I like about conservators, that the questions are they're practical, they're tangible. They're like, okay, how do we do this differently? Just tell me how to do it differently. Like, and but for me, that's a conversation between me and conservators, because I also want to understand that world and why they do the things they do, how they do them, and where we can find a common ground where our needs on both ends are being fulfilled. I would like to not see, particularly for native materials, just not see objects labeled directly. Ideally, because we currently, institutions are still working hard to try and there's still a lot of work needed to try and repatriate collections that are subject to NAGPRA. But there's a lot of other collections that we know were stolen, who maybe don't fall under NAGPRA, but eventually that hopefully will be returned. And so if we can keep ourselves from labeling everything directly and approach every object as an object that may return to the community, and think about how we want that community to receive that item, I think those are important things to keep in mind when thinking about these kinds of practices.
Absolutely. The next question kind of is related, so I'll just jump in. For objects that have already been labeled, should these labels, such as the location on the object or the type of label, be included in the information that gets sent to tribal members or community members before their visit? The SAR guidelines for collaboration gives a list of things that should be provided before a visit. Are there any not included there that you would encourage conservators or other museum professionals to include prior to a visit? It's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, no, the guidelines are great. My last slide that I couldn't get to had a list of resources for people to check out, and that was one of them. So I'm glad that we're getting an opportunity to bring that up now. What was the first part of the question again?
Should labels?
Yeah. Yes. I give tribes everything, all the information possible, and encourage people to do so. Like all the documentation, all the copies of all the documentation we have, copies of any photos we have, the labels, if they want the labels, the paper labels, the tags, all that may all be very important information, and in some ways is a history of how the museum treated these items. A lot of these labels carry really wild information, has nothing to do with the object, so it's an interesting insight into what people were thinking at the time. And if tribes want to throw them away, once the object is theirs, they can throw them away. We do keep a record at the museum, because I think it's an important piece of museum history, and a reference point for where we have been and how we need to move forward.
The next question comes in from an anonymous person who asks, if an early career person sees a red flag, how do we report this and ensure it's taken seriously? The power dynamic can be problematic in ensuring change, and do you have any advice on ways to approach that?
Yes, I've been there myself. It is tough, and I think that's something that we need to change in the culture of museum work in general. The nature of hierarchies. Again, like, who are we valuing? What do we value? How can we have conversations without feeling threatened or intimidated? The power dynamics can be tricky. So I just want to validate how you're feeling. That's all very real. What I've done in the past is, if I knew there was a red flag and I brought it to my immediate supervisor, or I didn't think that I could for whatever reason, that this is why community is important, a community of peers, but a community of also larger professional community, because you can reach out to someone who respects you and values your opinion, and get more direct advice about your specific situation. And then that person can contact somebody else and say, hey, I heard about this, or I want to look into this, and that can get the ball rolling. if you're interested in making sure that we just do the right thing and not about getting credit for doing the right thing, which is a whole other issue, then reaching out to people who do have leverage, who you do have a positive relationship with can help. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is kind of coming from a flip side. Apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, but Sarah, do you have any suggestions for how those of us who are supervisors of emerging conservators can encourage our interns to develop openness to working with colleagues specializing in repatriation?
That's a good question, how we can encourage them. I found many of the students I work with are very interested, and I haven't really had to push anybody. But again, these are, people are self-selecting to contact me or to participate in programs that do embrace repatriation. So I would make it mandatory, like really, like if they're not getting this education in school and they're in an internship program or they're in an institution, this is a training they just have to do. If they want to move into this area, it has to be just a mandatory requirement that they understand what NAGPRA, at the bare minimum NAGPRA, what NAGPRA is, why it's important, what the institutional approach is and stance is on it, and how and to know that there's that the community at the museum, the professional community, is standing together on that issue. And if that is not the case, then that's a problem. Because a student can walk into a situation and find people who are not interested in repatriation, think it's a terrible thing, and not have any incentive to need to change because they're seeing people in a position where they're getting away with this. So there also has to be, we have to look at ourselves and say, like, are we really committed to this? And do we make it clear that we stand together in commitment to this?
Thank you.
Following up on that, we have a question who asks, how do you deal with a museum board that's really against repatriation and coming from a place of institutional racism?
Oh my, yeah, that's tough, but it's real. It's not an uncommon situation. A lot of museum boards are made up of collectors that collect the very things the museum needs to return. It's tricky, it's complicated. They're also in charge of funding sometimes, so people don't want to push back too hard. One of the things that I do, I really try and keep up with developments in repatriation, any changes that might be coming to legislation, to how the legislation is enforced. Keeping up with the Association of American Indian Affairs is a good place. Of course, National NAGPRA as well. There's the Association of American Indian Affairs has a conference every year where they focus on repatriation. You can get current information on where things are headed. And one of the places where things are headed is fines and sometimes steep fines. So there's the ability for institutions to be fined now, and that's not being enforced really, but I can see that happening in the future. There's going to be a point where it's going to be more expensive not to do NAGPRA than to do NAGPRA. And for some of these places, that's what they need to hear, and because they're thinking about their own interests. And so if they want to not spend $1,000 a day on fines when they're not complying, then that might be what gets them moving. The other one, which I am leaning, which the other strategy I think would be, again, to build that larger network of professional support systems that you can lean on to come in from the outside and say, hey, what's going on with this? Because if you've tried, or if your staff have tried all kinds of angles, sometimes the angle that works is public shame. It's just public shame. And some institutions have no shame, so that doesn't work either. But that's where the fines maybe could come in.
We have another question from Tessa, who asks, you mentioned the Museum of Us, but are there other places you'd point to where they're experimenting with different ways of working towards repatriation, or just areas that you'd like to highlight?
Let's see. The University of Denver, the Museum of Anthropology, I think, the University of British Columbia. They're outside of NAGPRA, but they're doing really interesting things with communities and collections. There are places that are doing things. Those come at the top of my head. I wonder if I have them, my little list here. There's also projects like Carrying Our Ancestors Home out of UCLA. It's includes many videos of tribal members talking about repatriation and what that's meant for them and what that process has been like. The Sustainable Heritage Network, the Association of Tribal Libraries, Museums, and Archives. So these are also just projects that maybe aren't directly tied to repatriation, but they're places that cultivate systems of support so that we can do repatriation. The School for Advanced Research, there are guidelines for collaboration, as was mentioned earlier.
Yeah, these are all wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And just a reminder for participants, this is recorded, so if you're interested in those links, they will, or in those resources, they will be recorded as well, and we can also share your resources slide afterwards.
The next question comes from Soraya, who asks, can you comment on NAGPRA and possible implementation in US territories and ways to use it as guidelines? And for context, she's located in Puerto Rico.
Well, that's a really good question. I am not a lawyer and I don't want to give advice that might not be entirely correct, but I would really encourage you to look at, to communicate with the Association of American Indian Affairs and National NAGPRA and get a hold of people there and see how they can help you.
We also had a question, and it kind of overlaps with my personal question. So there was someone who was asking if we do not have direct contact with Indigenous communities, but we would like to confer regarding an Indigenous item that has not been repatriated. What's the best way to reach out to find someone? And kind of expanding on that, if you're kind of an individual that's not a part of an institution, but own something that you would like to repatriate, what would be the methods to do so?
Yeah, I want to make sure I captured all of that. So I'll answer one part of the question. If you are an individual who owns things that you'd like to return, so as an individual, you're not subject to any kind of federal laws around this, although that might change in the future. But a lot of museums may not take these kinds of items. What you can do is you can reach out directly to the tribe if you know who to contact. And some museums or universities may help you find out who you need to reach out to. So you can contact the museum and let them know, or university, about what your situation is and if they can help point you in the right direction. But a lot of information is available online, a lot of contact information. So you can, if you know who the community is that you need to work with, you can reach out to them directly, and that this sort of thing does happen. Like I get gotten contacted by people who have collections that they want to return, and things have usually turned out pretty favorably. In my experience, I mean, sometimes things don't, but you can try.
Thank you.
The next question comes in from Michaela, who starts off by saying that there was a lot of great information in the session about things to do once collaboration has already begun, and then asks, what would you say is the most important thing or things that a conservator can keep in mind or do when working within an institution where decisions about repatriation and stakeholder access are often outside of the direct control of the conservator?
So many good questions. The best thing that a conservator could do, could you repeat that the last part of that question, please?
Sure. So it was asking, what are the things that a conservator can keep in mind or do when working with an institution, especially where decisions about repatriation and stakeholder access are often outside of the direct control of a conservator? Kind of, I guess, thinking about like the role within a larger institution.
Yeah. Oftentimes the repatriation process is outside the control of a conservator. Sometimes it's a curator or a repatriation staff member that's doing this. So I think that's where you can build that relationship with those individuals and start cultivating that, but also to question how involved you want to be, how involved you think you can be, how whether you are prepared to enter into that kind of work and not create more work or more harm. So I think we all could keep asking ourselves those questions regularly. But I think that's a matter of building those relationships if you want to support it. But also, you can support work. I have colleagues who, when asked about how they'd like the institution to direct funding or what grants should we be focusing on, instead of saying I want to fund my project, they'll say we like what's happening with repatriation. We know there's a lot of work that's going on there. Let's shift the conversation to that. So there's ways where you're not maybe directly involved in the practice of repatriation, but you're supporting by reminding people that this is a priority, and by stepping aside and encouraging that resources are directed to that work. So that's one strategy.
I realize we're 5 minutes over, so anyone who needs to leave, feel free to leave, but we do have more questions that are coming in. Lilium, your talk definitely sparked a lot of conversation. So if you don't mind, we might run for another 5 minutes just to try and cover some of those.
Sure,
for those of you who have to leave.
Minutes.
Yeah, perfect.
Oh yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good. I can. Yeah, I'm good. I can stay for another 5 minutes. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, we'll try to go through these quickly. So we have a question from Sarah, who asked, earlier you referenced situations in which repatriation work is isolated from other projects in which it could actually be included and integrated in a constructive way. Are you able to describe any examples, or can you describe any examples of that kind of work?
Well, I guess my imagination went somewhere else. Something I'd like to see, but something that I have seen is increasingly museums are recognizing the value of repatriation work outside of the simple repatriation process. That because some of these projects can take years and they involve a lot of conversation back and forth because people are reviewing a lot of collection items, correcting data. There's a lot of research that can sometimes go into it. That there's more of an appreciation of the value that it has for the museum as a whole. And I think that's allowed for more interdepartmental work. So I know that there are museums who have systems where curators are share information with repatriation staff and vice versa, where education staff work with repatriation staff to incorporate curriculum on repatriation into programs about museums. Programs departments can tackle repatriation as a subject and can invite tribal members to discuss what this process is like for them. There's, like I mentioned, people with the Carrying Our Ancestors Home project, like they've done some of that, really highlighting Native voices in this process. And so, I mean, that's what comes to mind. I also, one repatriation I worked on, the tribe was interested in doing an exhibition on their repatriation journey. So that's something that could happen, or institutions could explore. But I would not lead those discussions in that direction. I would the tribe should really, it should be their interest and part of their goals. Not something that, you know, we shouldn't do a quid pro quo where, you know, we have a great exhibition and then we'll repatriate or anything like that. It's like the tribe really needs to dictate the terms.
Absolutely.
The next question comes in from Megan, who asks, you mentioned the issues of objects that require special measures of traditional care in museums, and that perhaps these items should not necessarily be in a museum. Do you see some expansion of the categories for repatriation in the future, if not necessarily in formal legislation, but more in a provocative way by the way that museums see themselves and their role?
Yeah, yes, I think that that they think that there may be changes to legislation. I mean, a lot of the conversations I'm hearing in some repatriation spaces are for a push for expansion, which is interesting also because there's still museums that are struggling with just the very basics. So that needs to be handled as well. But there's nothing, NAGPRA sets up the bare minimum that an institution is responsible for. They can do more. Museums can do more. And I think it's going to take public pressure. I think it's going to take a real reckoning of our histories as, you know, in museums, and a real evaluation of, you know, what do we have that we know was stolen, that we have physical evidence that tells us this was stolen. And so when you look at European artwork, for instance, if a museum realizes that they have something that was stolen from Italy, that gets returned, you know, and yet, you know, we are here with objects and archives with affiliated documents that say, you know, haha, this person didn't realize I took it. Like things, there's all kinds of things in the archive that incriminate people who were collecting these objects. And you know, in some cases you could say these are criminal cases of stolen materials. And so if we have that evidence, I don't see why a museum would not include it in their policies to return those objects. At the bare minimum, those objects.
Thank you, William. I think we're going to end the conversation here. There are a few more questions in the chat, but I think some of them have already been answered. I know, Lilium, there's a lot of enthusiasm coming in through the chat, and a lot of people who are really grateful for this talk. So we'll try and make sure we share those sentiments with you before we sign off, or before we're done. So I don't think we can give a full round of applause from all the audience members. So I hope you'll let Jenny and I kind of speak to all of you. This has been really great. We're really grateful to have you. This has brought up a lot of interesting topics for us to consider and think about going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the questions. I only know what I know. There are many other people who know more than me. There's a whole community of practitioners. There's the NAGPRA community of practice out of Denver. So that's something to look into as well. And let's see how we can get this done.